Listening, multiple choice, multiple answers, guided practice. Let's start. Question number 1 for you.
In 2007, the Washington Post reported that the United States military was testing this robot that diffused landmines. And the way it worked was it was shaped like a stick insect, and it would walk around a minefield on its legs. And every time it stepped on a mine, one of the legs would blow up, and it would continue on the other legs to blow up more mines. And the colonel who's in charge of this testing exercise ends up calling it off because he says it's too inhumane to watch this damaged robot drag itself along the minefield. Now, what would cause a hardened military officer and someone like myself to have this response to robots? Well, of course, we're primed by science fiction and pop culture to really want to personify these things. But it goes a little bit deeper than that. It turns out that we're biologically hardwired to project intent and life onto any movement in our physical space that seems autonomous to us. So people will treat all sorts of robots like they're alive. These bomb disposal units get names, they get medals of honor. They've had funerals for them with gun salutes. And research shows that we do this even with very simple household robots, like the Roomba vacuum cleaner.
Here are the answers. The question was, which of the following factors contributed to the colonel's decision to call off the robotic landmine diffusion exercise? What do you have in your notes? In my notes, I have robot, then landmine, stick insect, blue legs, colonel called off, inhuman. Then I've written surprise and a question mark, that is it surprising that, the colonel called off? And then I've written intent, life, and an arrow movement, that anything that moves, we tend to think of it as something with life. So that's how I have taken my notes and I remember this. Based upon that, the second option, colonel found it inhuman to watch the injured robot carry on with the task. Yeah, that's a correct option. And biologically, human beings are hardwired to treat any autonomous moving thing as alive. So that's also because I wrote down movement and life. So that helped me remember this third sentence, and that's a correct option. So as I said earlier, there are a number of ways to go about this. And ideally, you will use the whole combination of taking notes, visualization, and looking at the options while you're listening. But if you're not comfortable, if you don't feel confident doing all these things together, then at least try to understand and take notes. That should also be enough to answer these questions correctly. Let's go to the next question now.
People who are frequently infected with malaria learn to deal with it. They get the infection, but they don't get ill. The recipe is encoded in antibodies. My team went back to our complex parasite, probed it with samples from Africans who had overcome malaria to answer the question, what does a successful antibody response look like? We found over 200 proteins, many of which are not on the radar for malaria vaccines. My research community may be missing out important parts of the parasite. Until recently, when one had identified a protein of interest, they tested whether it might be important for a vaccine by conducting a cohort study. This typically involved about 300 participants in a village in Africa whose samples were analyzed to see whether antibodies to the protein would predict who got malaria and who did not. In the past 30 years, these studies have tested a small number of proteins in relatively few samples and usually in single locations.
Here are the answers. The questions were, which of the following are not characteristics of the cohort studies done for vaccines? So by reading the question, you can guess that the audio is going to be about vaccines and about some studies done, cohort studies done for those vaccines. And you have to identify the statements which are not characteristics of those studies. So the statements that are not correct as per the audio, those are the ones you have to pick, or in other words, the ones which are correct, you have to eliminate them. Now, in my notes, I've written malaria, not ill. The way I've written not is just a cross and then ILL. I wrote antibodies, not the full word. After that, samples, tests. Then what I've written few participants, small locations, small samples. These are the kind of words I've written. And then based upon that, if you look at, it becomes easy to eliminate the options, to find the options which are correct and which are mentioned in the audio. So studies to identify if a particular protein that was mentioned, and it was in my notes, small number of proteins, single location, few participants, all of that was captured in my notes. So I knew these are characteristics. And then that just leaves me with these three options: commissioned by medical association, not supervised, results disputed. Nothing like a dispute or these things were mentioned in the audio. So that means those are not characteristics, and that's why I've selected those options. Let's go to the next question now.
And I'd just love to spend the whole evening walking this through with you, but I'll make you disappointed. I cannot do that. In fact, the only thing I can do with you is just to assure you that this is the first time it's done. Nobody has ever tried to really analytically combine the Sustainable Development Goals with planetary boundaries, and we were able to find patterns and really convergent trends that gives us a lot of confidence in our ability to now project economic development, resource use from water, food and energy, population growth, income per person, along these consistent and systemic pathways. So the first time we have a robust opportunity to really explore the futures of ability of attain the SDGs within PBs. Now, how do we do this? Well, look at this. Well, here you have the data coming from real world, calibrated through 1970 to 2015, 100,000 data points around the world, building on 7 regions, ability of really picking on all these Sustainable Development Goals.
The answers, if you read the question first, so the statements that correctly describe what the speaker is talking about in the audio. Now, when the speaker starts talking, the first few statements, he's kind of warming up the audience. Like, I can talk about this all evening, you won't like it, etc. This is the first time I'm doing it. So when you hear statements like that, you always keep in mind that it's just an introduction. They are not really the focus of the talk. So that's not where the key information is. So there's no need to write these things down in your notes, that first time talking or spend an evening. Instead, only focus on things, which are actually related to the audio, to the topic, and which seem important, right? Now in my notes, I have written SDG plus planet bounds as a short form for planetary boundaries. Then I've written patterns, trends, how, and against how I've written a question mark and then explanation. So if I now look at my notes, the first option I can easily validate because I've written SDG plus planetary boundaries. So that's what the option is. He talks about linking sustainable development goals with planetary boundaries. And then the last part of my notes, it tells that he explains how to do it. So that is the third option, explains the methodology used to link, etc. Okay, but the other options, he doesn't describe the ways in which these goals can be achieved or lack of coordination, etc. So there's nothing I found in the audio which supported these other statements. All right. So focus on understanding, take good notes, and then confidently based upon those notes, you can select your options. Don't overthink. Whatever you remember plus whatever you have in your notes, that usually should be enough to help you pick the correct options. The last practice question in this session.
We live in a medication nation. 4.5 billion drug prescriptions will be prescribed by doctors like me this year in the United States alone. That's 15 for every man, woman, and child. And for most of us, our experience with these medications is often confusing number of pills, instructions, side effects, one-size-fits-all dosing, which all too often we aren't taking as prescribed. And this comes at tremendous expense, costing us our time, our money, and our health. And in our exponential, connected, data-driven age, I think we can and we must do better. So let's take a dive at some of the challenges we have and some potential solutions. Let's start with the fact that many drugs don't work for those who are prescribed to them. For the top 10 grossing drugs in the United States this year, they only benefit 1 in 4 to 1 in 23 who take them. That's great if you're number one, but what about everybody else? And what's worse, drugs, when they sometimes don't work, can still cause side effects. Take aspirin. About 1 in 4 of us who take aspirin to reduce our risk of cardiovascular disease are unknowingly aspirin resistant and still have the same risks of gastrointestinal bleeds that kill thousands every year.
The answers. The question was, which of the following is not one of the problems with drug prescriptions discussed in the audio? That tells me the audio is going to be about drug prescriptions and the problems with that, and the options, each option is then supposed to be one problem with the drug prescription, and I have to pick the ones which are not mentioned in the audio. In my notes, I've written 4.5b prescriptions, unsupervised, expensive, don't work, side effects, aspirin. So that's all that I have in my notes. And based upon that, the first statement, number of prescriptions issued is very high. That's correct. I've written 4.5 billion prescriptions. So that is a correct problem. But we have to select the one which is not discussed in the audio. So we don't select that option. The next, the unmonitored drug prescriptions have made many people aspirin resistant. Now, it does talk about aspirin, but not that the prescriptions, they have made people resistant to aspirin. So that's not, it's aspirin, and aspirin resistance is mentioned as an example, as a side effect, but not that all these drug prescriptions have, or only the drug prescriptions have caused that. So that's why it's not a problem with the drug prescriptions, and we select that option. The next one, doctors are prescribing drugs without thinking about the long-term impacts. So this is not clearly mentioned anywhere again, and it's not in my notes, so I'll select that option. After that, too many prescriptions have confusing instructions and aren't taken as prescribed. In my notes, I've written unsupervised. So that, which reminds me that the audio mentioned people are taking the prescriptions in an unsupervised manner. So this option sort of relates to that and seems it is a correct problem according to the audio. So we won't select it. And most of the top drugs prescribed benefit only about a quarter of people. So now I haven't written this in my notes, but from what I remember him mentioning 1/4, 1/20. So that tells me this is probably related to that. So again, it's a correct problem and I won't select that. So a combination of the notes plus what you remember, and then you should also be able to link those things, right? He mentioned 1/4 or 1/20 benefit, that only 1/4 or 1/20 patients who are prescribed benefit from a prescription. So from that, a quarter. So you should be able to link that 1/4 is quarter and it's referring to that thing. All right. So that's how you go about this. Make sure that you have checked your answers as well, and you understand if you have not been able to answer the question correctly, that is, answer all the options correctly, then you must spend some time to understand why you made that mistake.